What if your family tree wasn't about where you came from, but about who had to die so you could exist? I don't mean metaphorically. I don't mean war or disease or bad luck. I mean chosen. And what if, right now at this exact moment, your name is already written somewhere in ink that never dries? Think about it. Every family has gaps in its history, stories that trail off, names no one explains, that uncle who passed suddenly, that child no one talks about, that generation with too many graves and not enough answers. We're told it's coincidence, that life is fragile, that death doesn't need a reason. But what if it does? What if those deaths weren't random, but payments? Because tonight we're talking about the Bloodline Ledger, not a family record, not a church registry, not a book of births, marriages, or inheritances. This book doesn't care about love. It doesn't care about legacy. It only cares about balance. A ledger doesn't tell stories. It keeps score. And this one keeps score in blood. According to whispered historical accounts, the Bloodline Ledger is a book that appears only around families who shouldn't still exist. Families that survive famine when others starve. Families that rise while empires collapse. Families that always seem to land on their feet, no matter how hard the fall. But here's the cost no one puts in the history books. For every generation that thrives, someone from the bloodline must die. Not old, not peacefully, but early. And once your family's name is written inside the ledger, someone always dies next. The terrifying part? The book doesn't ask permission. It doesn't knock. It doesn't warn. It just appears, sometimes in a church, sometimes in an archive, sometimes buried where no one was meant to look. And when it does, the names inside aren't random. They're precise. Generations mapped like branches. Deaths marked like check marks. Some names crossed out. Some circled. Some still forming. Faint. Unfinished. As if the ink is waiting for the right moment to settle. People who've claimed to see the ledger say the same thing. The book feels aware, like it knows when you're reading it, like it knows which name you're looking for, like it's patient, because it's been around longer than memory, longer than governments, longer than borders, longer than the idea that death is random. And here's the detail that should make you uncomfortable. The ledger doesn't predict the future, it enforces it. If your family is inside, the payment is inevitable. You can delay it, you can hide from it, but you can't erase it. So, before we go any further, before we rewind into history, I want you to think about your own bloodline, about who lived long lives and who didn't, about the deaths that never made sense. Because if the Bloodline Ledger is real, and history suggests it might be, then survival isn't luck, it's a transaction. Let's rewind. In 1637, in a fog-choked village tucked along the edge of the Black Forest, there was a church no one rang bells for anymore. Not because it was abandoned, not because the ropes had snapped or the bells had cracked, but because everyone inside was dead. That's not something a village notices all at once. At first, it's subtle. Too subtle. A candle that doesn't get replaced. A sermon that never starts. A door that stays shut one morning, then the next. In a place where routine is everything, silence becomes louder than any bell ever could. By the 7th day, people started whispering. By the 8th, they stopped whispering. A small group of men, fathers, sons, brothers, approached the church just before dawn. The fog clung to their boots, the kind of fog that feels intentional, like it doesn't want you seeing too far ahead. They forced the doors open, and the smell hit them first. Not rot, not decay. Fear. Inside, the church was full. 37 bodies. Every pew occupied. Every aisle blocked. People collapsed where they had been praying, or running, or trying to reach someone they loved. No wounds. No blood spilled across the stone floor. No signs of a fight. Just faces locked into the same expression, mouths open wide, eyes stretched too far, as if something had stolen the sound from their screams. Some were on their knees, hands clasped so tightly their fingers had gone pale. Children were found clutching their parents' clothes. Parents were found shielding children who hadn't survived anyway. And then there was the priest. He sat at the altar, perfectly still, hands folded neatly, back straight, expression calm, almost peaceful, until you looked at his eyes. They weren't cloudy, they weren't damaged, they were burned completely white, as if something had passed through them rather than into them. No one spoke. There are moments when language just shuts down, when your brain refuses to label what your eyes are seeing, because naming it would make it real. This was one of those moments. At first, the villagers did what humans have always done when something doesn't make sense. They blamed the plague. They always do. Plague explains everything without explaining anything. It gives you permission not to ask questions. It lets you sleep. So they sealed the church. They marked the doors. They prayed from a distance. But the explanation didn't hold. There were no sores, no blackened skin, no coughing blood. And most unsettling of all, there had been no deaths in the village for weeks before this. No sickness, no warnings. 37 people had gone from breathing to gone, all at once. That's when someone noticed the altar stone wasn't sitting right. It was cracked, shifted, as if it had been moved recently. 4 men lifted it. Underneath was a shallow hollow carved into the stone foundation, and inside that hollow was a book, not parchment-bound, not leather-bound. It was bound in human skin, stretched tight, stitched carefully, still warm. That's the detail that made people step back, because there was no logical reason for it to still be warm, no fire, no fresh bodies. Yet the book felt like it had just been alive. On the cover, burned deep into the skin like a permanent scar, were 4 words. What is owed must bleed. No one touched it at first, because everyone there understood something without saying it out loud. This wasn't a record. It was a reckoning. Eventually, curiosity won. It always does. They opened it. Inside were names. Not a list. Not a census. Bloodlines. Entire families recorded generation by generation, written in different inks, different handwriting styles, different centuries. Some names were neat and elegant. Others were jagged, rushed, desperate. Dates followed each entry. Some dates were crossed out. Some were circled. Some had symbols next to them. Marks no one recognized. Shapes that didn't belong to any language spoken there. And near the back of the book, pages that looked blank at first glance. Almost blank. But if you tilted the page in the light, you could see it. Faint outlines of letters, names that weren't finished yet, waiting. One man recognized his family name. He didn't scream, he didn't point, he just collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. Panic finally broke the silence. The book was slammed shut. The altar stone was dropped back into place. The church was sealed tighter than before. By sunset, the ledger was gone. No one ever admitted to taking it. But that didn't matter, because the damage was already done. People who had touched the book began dying, not instantly, not dramatically, just wrong. A woman who helped lift it lost her voice overnight. Her throat was untouched, but no sound ever came out again. A man who turned its pages bled from the nose until he drowned in his own blood. A boy who brushed the cover with his fingertips died screaming, in his sleep, clutching his chest like something was tearing outward. No marks, no illness, no explanation. Within a month, the village was empty, homes abandoned, fields left to rot. Official church records later described the incident as mass hysteria, which is convenient. Because hysteria doesn't leave behind physical evidence that keeps reappearing, the book didn't disappear, it moved. From monastery to noble estate, from vault to archive, from family to family, always near bloodlines that prospered when others collapsed, always followed by deaths no one could explain, and always described the same way by those who saw it. The ledger felt aware, like it knew when it was being watched, like it knew which name you were looking for, like it was counting. Because the Bloodline Ledger wasn't created to document history. It was created to enforce a debt. And this moment, this discovery in a forgotten church, wasn't the beginning. It was the first time humanity realized the debt was real. But here's the part that changes everything. The ledger didn't appear in that church by accident. It was placed there, left behind like a reminder or a warning, because the deal that created it was made centuries earlier, and the first family to sign it didn't use ink. The earliest confirmed entry in the Bloodline Ledger dates back to 1199. That year didn't arrive gently, it arrived starving. Winter came early and stayed too long. The kind of winter that doesn't just freeze the ground, it erases it. Rivers stopped moving, roads vanished, entire villages disappeared under snow so deep it swallowed rooftops. Crops failed, animals collapsed in the fields, and children learned how to die quietly. That detail comes up again and again in surviving accounts. Quietly. Not because they were brave, but because crying wasted energy. In the middle of all this lived a noble family, wealthy on paper, powerful by name, but just as desperate as everyone else once the food ran out. Gold doesn't feed you when there's nothing to buy. By midwinter, their estate had become a waiting room for death. Servants fled or starved. Guards abandoned their posts. The family burned furniture to stay warm. And at the center of it all was the patriarch, a man raised to believe God rewarded loyalty, a man who had done everything right. He prayed the first night because that's what you do. He prayed the second night because hope is stubborn. He prayed the third night because desperation has nowhere else to go. On the fourth night, something answered, not a voice, not thunder, not a dream. Something stepped into the room. Witnesses later struggled to describe it, which should tell you everything. They said it looked unfinished, too tall for the ceiling, but not bending, too still for something alive, but not motionless. Its joints didn't sit right. Its shadow bent in directions the torchlight didn't allow. And its face. That's where descriptions stopped agreeing. Some said it had too many features. Others said it had none. But everyone agreed on one thing. It did not feel ancient. It felt patient. It spoke without moving its mouth. Not aloud. Inside. It didn't threaten. It didn't bargain like a merchant. It simply explained. It told the patriarch the winter would end by morning. that crops would return, that his bloodline would survive when others vanished into history. Generations of power, protection from famine, plague, war. But survival isn't free. The cost wasn't gold. The cost wasn't land. The cost wasn't worship. It was continuity through blood. One life from the bloodline. Every generation, not chosen by age, not chosen by guilt, chosen by necessity. The patriarch hesitated. Of course he did. He asked questions. He begged for alternatives. The thing didn't argue. It simply showed him visions of his descendants thriving while the world burned around them. And then, graves, fresh ones, always one per generation. The message was clear. This wasn't punishment. It was balance. If the family refused, they would starve like everyone else. Forgotten. Gone. If they agreed, they would live. But someone would always pay. The patriarch agreed. The ledger appeared the moment the decision was made. Not summoned. Not handed over. It simply existed, resting on the table like it had always been there. Bound in skin that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Blank pages waiting. The patriarch didn't use ink. He pressed his thumb into a bowl, signed his family name in blood. The moment the final letter was written, the torches burned brighter. Outside, snow began to melt. By morning, the winter ended, not slowly, instantly. Frozen rivers cracked open. Crops pushed through soil that should have been dead. Livestock gave birth in numbers that didn't make sense. The famine was over. The family survived. And for 6 months, nothing happened. That's important, because it's what convinced them the price had been symbolic. That maybe, just maybe, the thing had lied. Until the youngest son collapsed at dinner. No warning, no sickness. Blood poured from his nose, ears, mouth, places blood should never come from all at once. His skin went pale, his eyes rolled back. He died before anyone could touch him. No injury, no illness, just emptied. The first payment. That's when the family realized the truth too late. The ledger didn't ask if. It decided when. They tried to pray. Nothing answered. They tried to destroy the book. It wouldn't burn. They tried to hide it. It reappeared. Every generation after that learned the same lesson. Prosperity always came. And so did the death. Sometimes it was a child, sometimes a sibling, sometimes the healthiest person in the room, never predictable, never negotiable, and always recorded. Each payment crossed out in the ledger with precision, no emotion, no hesitation, because this wasn't cruelty. It was accounting. And here's the detail that still chills historians. The ledger updated itself. Names rearranged when bloodlines merged. New branches formed when children were born. Ink darkened when a payment was overdue. It wasn't bound to a place. It was bound to blood. Over the centuries, families tried to cheat it, changing names, marrying out, denying ancestry. The ledger adapted because it didn't care about identity. It cared about chemistry, about lineage, about debt. And the thing that created it? It never appeared again, not because it vanished, but because it didn't need to. The ledger did the work now. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because once families understood the rules, they tried to break them. And when a bloodline refuses to pay, the ledger doesn't forgive. It collects everything at once. By the time historians realized the Bloodline Ledger wasn't just a relic, it was already too late. Because the ledger isn't passive. It doesn't sit on a shelf waiting to be opened. It doesn't gather dust. It doesn't forget. It watches. Families who survived long enough to study it noticed patterns, Small ones at first, the kind you can ignore if you don't want to see them. Names shifted when families migrated. Ink darkened when bloodlines merged through marriage. Entire new pages appeared the moment a child was born, not when the birth was recorded, when the blood existed. That's the detail that unsettled people the most. The ledger didn't care about documents. It didn't care about witnesses. It responded to biology. Changing surnames didn't help. Families tried it anyway, they always do. They anglicized names, shortened them, erased accents, invented entirely new identities. The ledger followed without hesitation. Adoption didn't help. Children raised outside the family line still appeared, sometimes faintly, sometimes fully written, depending on how closely their blood matched the original lineage. Running didn't help either. Families crossed borders, oceans. Empires rose and fell around them. The ledger kept pace. Because it didn't track identity, it tracked blood chemistry. Historians struggled with that idea for decades. Blood chemistry wasn't something medieval people understood. Yet, the ledger behaved as if it knew exactly what it was looking for, down to the smallest inherited trace. One scholar described it this way: "It doesn't know who you are, it knows what you're made of." The ledger also updated itself, not symbolically, physically. Witnesses reported hearing pages turn on their own, ink flowing where no quill touched, names rearranging when marriages joined two bloodlines already listed inside. When two ledger families merged, the book didn't double the debt, it combined it. One life per generation, still. But the choice became harsher, because now the ledger had options. By the late 1800s, a handful of historians began to notice something else. The ledger reacted to awareness. Families who didn't know about it often lost someone quietly. An accident, a sudden illness, something easy to explain away. Families who did know suffered differently. Deaths became specific, personal, as if the ledger resented being watched. That brings us to London, 1891. A historian, young, ambitious, skeptical, was cataloging artifacts recovered from a burned estate outside the city. Most of it was junk, ledgers, letters, receipts, until he opened one book that felt wrong. It was heavier than it should have been, warmer than the room. He recognized the binding immediately, human skin. Inside, he saw the name of his grandfather, not similar, exact. Next to it was the date of death. Correct. His hands shook as he turned the page. There was his father's name, still alive, still breathing. And on the page after that, nothing. At least that's what it looked like at first. Then he tilted the page toward the light. An outline, faint, incomplete. His name, forming. He did what any rational person would do when faced with something impossible. He destroyed it. He burned the ledger in his fireplace until the binding cracked and the pages curled. The fire burned green. 2 days later, his sister died. She was healthy, young. She collapsed at breakfast, choking on nothing. No obstruction, no poison. Autopsy revealed her lungs were filled with blood, not ruptured, filled, as if her body had turned against itself. The ledger had already adjusted. It always does, because destroying the physical book doesn't cancel the debt. It only removes the warning. Families learned this lesson the hard way. Those who tried to hide the ledger found it resurfacing in places it couldn't possibly be. Locked safes opened themselves, buried vaults cracked, pages found folded inside family Bibles. The ledger wanted to be seen, not to scare, but to remind. And then there were the families who tried to delay payment. They noticed patterns. Deaths tended to occur during times of peace, during prosperity. So they changed how they lived. They avoided risk. They controlled exposure. They shielded their children obsessively. And for a while, nothing happened. Years passed. Then decades. Some families went almost an entire generation without payment. They thought they'd beaten it. They were wrong. Because the ledger doesn't forget. It remembers. And it charges interest. When payment is delayed too long, the ledger stops choosing gently. Deaths stop being singular. They stack. A child dies unexpectedly. Then a parent. Then a cousin in another country. Not spread out, clustered, as if the ledger is catching up all at once. Witnesses describe these periods as corrections, the book balancing itself. And here's the detail that turns dread into terror. The ledger doesn't always take from the same branch. It chooses strategically the healthiest, the most loved, the one whose absence will hurt the most. Not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. Because pain doesn't matter to the ledger, impact does. Families began to realize something horrifying. The longer they delayed, the worse the payment became. One death per generation wasn't mercy, it was restraint. And restraint could be withdrawn. By the early 1900s, most families who knew the truth stopped fighting it. They didn't like it. They didn't accept it. But they complied. They rationalized. It's just one, they told themselves. It's better than losing everything. They didn't choose who died, but they stopped asking why. And that silence, that compliance, that's what allowed the ledger to survive into the modern world, because it doesn't need belief. It only needs bloodlines to continue. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of this before, that's part of how it operates too. Families who prosper don't advertise the cost. Histories get cleaned up. Records disappear. Deaths get explained away. The ledger thrives in secrecy because the less people talk about it, the easier it is to collect. But eventually, one family decided silence wasn't enough. They didn't want to delay. They didn't want to hide. They wanted to end it. And when a bloodline refuses to pay, the ledger doesn't negotiate. It collects everything. By 1933, the Bloodline Ledger was no longer a rumor. Not to the families who carried it. Not to the ones who whispered about it behind locked doors, careful never to say its name too loudly, like it might hear. By then, the rules were understood. One life per generation, prosperity in exchange, survival always, at a cost. Most families complied quietly. They didn't like it. They didn't accept it. But they complied because the alternative, losing everything, felt worse. Most families, but not all. In 1933, one family decided the cycle ended with them. They were educated, wealthy, modern. They believed in science, not superstition, records, not whispers. And more importantly, they believed knowledge gave them control. They'd inherited the ledger along with land, estates, and a history too long to deny. They'd seen the pattern, counted the graves, matched the dates, and they decided something no family before them had dared to decide openly. They would refuse payment. Their plan was simple. They didn't try to burn the ledger. They didn't try to tear out pages. They knew by then that destruction didn't work. Instead, they buried it. A steel safe, reinforced, sealed, lowered deep beneath their estate, below the wine cellar, below the stone foundations, far from light, air, and attention. Then they did something even more dangerous. They pretended it never existed. No rituals, no acknowledgement, no preparation. They lived normally, and for a while, nothing happened. No sudden deaths, no unexplained illness, no accidents that didn't make sense. Years passed, then decades. Children grew up, grandparents aged naturally, the family relaxed. 27 years went by. 27 years without payment. That should have been impossible. They thought they'd broken this cycle. By the late 1950s, the ledger had become a story no one fully believed anymore. Something great-grandparents whispered about when they thought no one was listening. A superstition tied to darker centuries. The family convinced themselves the book had power only because people believed it did. And belief, they thought, could be unlearned. Then the deaths began, not gently, not logically, not in the order anyone expected. The first was a child, 8 years old, healthy, active, collapsed in the middle of the night, no fever, no illness, no cause. Doctors blamed a rare condition, something that just happens sometimes. The family mourned, but they didn't panic. One death could be coincidence. Then the grandmother died, not old enough to expect it, not sick. Found sitting upright in her chair, eyes open, hands clenched like she'd tried to grab something invisible. No cause of death. 2 deaths in 1 generation. That should have been impossible. That's when fear returned, quietly. But fear alone didn't make them dig up the ledger. They told themselves it was random. They told themselves they'd come too far to turn back now. Then, within the same year, 3 cousins died. Different cities, different circumstances. One in a car accident with no skid marks. One drowned in shallow water. One bled internally with no injury. 7 deaths total, 7. Not spread across generations. Stacked, compressed, as if time itself had folded. That's when they opened the ground. The safe was exactly where they left it. Untouched, unbroken. But when they opened it, the ledger was already open, not closed, not waiting. Open, pages spread wide like it had been expecting them. Every unpaid name was violently crossed out, not neatly, not carefully. Scratched through so hard the pages were torn. Beneath the final name, written in thick, dark ink that hadn't been there before, were 2 words: debt defaulted. There were no more blank pages, no forming names, no future entries. The bloodline had been closed, finished. The family didn't last another year. Deaths came faster now, not one by one, but in waves. A fire, a suicide, a stillbirth. An entire household found dead with no signs of struggle. No explanations stuck. Authorities tried to trace relatives. There were none. No descendants. No distant cousins. No one left to carry the name. The family vanished. And something strange happened afterward. Records disappeared. Property deeds vanished. Church registries went missing. Photographs faded or were destroyed. It wasn't just that the bloodline ended. It was as if history itself began forgetting them. As if the ledger didn't just collect lives, it erased proof. Silence, no music, no sound. Historians who later tried to reconstruct what happened ran into walls, contradictions, missing documents, entire decades unaccounted for. And those who dug too deep, they stopped writing, stopped researching, stopped breathing. No official cause listed, just sudden endings. Because the ledger didn't just punish refusal, it made an example. It taught surviving families a lesson that never needed to be written down. Compliance keeps the suffering contained. Refusal spreads it. From that moment on, families stopped talking about escape. They focused on management, control, minimizing damage. The ledger didn't need belief. It didn't need fear. It only needed continuation. And as long as bloodlines kept reproducing, the debt would always come due. But here's the final, unsettling truth. That family wasn't the last to try. They were just the last whose story was fully recorded. Because in the modern world, the ledger doesn't announce itself. It blends in, and the closer we get to the present day, the harder it is to tell who's paying the price and who's about to. Officially, the Bloodline Ledger does not exist. No museum displays it. No university claims it. No archive admits to housing it. Search long enough, and you'll find the same explanation, repeated again and again. Folklore, mass hysteria, a medieval superstition. History likes clean answers. But history also leaves patterns behind, and patterns are harder to erase. Because when you start looking, not at the stories, but at the outcomes, you begin to notice something unsettling. There are families that shouldn't still be standing. Dynasties that survived plagues, wars, depressions, revolutions. Bloodlines that lost fortunes, then regained them. Names that vanish for decades, only to resurface stronger than before. Impossible luck. The kind that gets talked about in business magazines and whispered about at funerals. And always, if you trace those families carefully enough, you'll find something else. Unexplained deaths, not loud ones, not dramatic ones, quiet ones. The uncle no one mentions anymore, the cousin who just didn't wake up, the child who died young and became a family shadow everyone avoids. Deaths that don't fit. Deaths that arrive just as things are about to go very, very right. It's easy to call that coincidence. That's what we're taught to do. But coincidence stops being coincidence when it repeats itself across centuries. Some modern historians, careful ones, quiet ones, have started noticing the same patterns the ledger once recorded openly. Not written in books, written in outcomes. They don't call it the Bloodline Ledger anymore. They call it statistical anomalies. Families with success rates that defy probability. Generational wealth that survives every collapse. Political dynasties untouched by scandal when others crumble. And then, every so often, a sudden death that resets the balance. No cause found. No explanation that sticks. Just another name quietly removed from the family tree. Some believe the ledger never stopped moving, that it adapted, that in a world of surveillance, databases, and digital records, a physical book became unnecessary, that the ledger learned to hide inside systems we trust, medical records, legal documents, insurance data, places where death already feels routine. Others believe the book still exists, that it appears briefly, only to families close to default, families that have delayed payment too long. They describe the same signs, a book appearing where it shouldn't be, pages warm to the touch, ink darker near certain names, and that feeling, that terrible, unmistakable feeling that the ledger wants to be seen, not to scare, to remind. Because here's the thing about debt. It doesn't go away just because you stop believing in it. And the Bloodline Ledger doesn't need fear. It only needs continuation. As long as families keep having children, as long as bloodlines keep branching, the balance must be maintained. Some families manage it quietly. They accept the loss. They don't talk about it. They don't question it. They mourn, then move on. And their luck continues. Others resist. They explain. They rationalize. They call it bad genes, bad timing, bad luck. But resistance doesn't erase debt. It delays it. And delayed debt gathers weight. There's one last detail most accounts agree on. The ledger doesn't always take someone you expect. It doesn't follow morality. It doesn't follow fairness. It follows impact. The one whose absence will hurt the most. the one whose death will ripple outward. Because the ledger isn't cruel, it's efficient. That's why the deaths feel personal. That's why families remember them for generations. And maybe that's the point. Because memory is what keeps the system alive. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. Think about your own family, about the stories that trail off, the names no one explains, the photos that feel incomplete. Every family has losses, that's true. But not every family thrives the way some do. Not every bloodline survives everything. And if survival has a cost, who paid it? Some believe the ledger still writes names, not in ink, in probability, in outcomes, in who gets lucky and who doesn't. And maybe, just maybe, it's writing one right now, yours, faint, incomplete, waiting. Because the bloodline ledger doesn't rush, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't knock. It waits until the balance tips, until someone has to be removed. So everything else can continue. And the scariest part? If your family is still here, if your bloodline is still standing, then someone, somewhere, already paid. And the ledger, it never forgets a debt. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about your own family history, you're not alone. Subscribe if you want more stories where history and horror overlap. Comment if you believe the bloodline ledger is just a myth, or if, deep down, you're not so sure. Because some books aren't meant to be found. They're meant to be balanced.